Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you happen to be watching this. And thank you so much for joining us in this discussion for a half hour with and featuring the film Sugarcane. I'm your host for today, Carla Renata, and I'd like to introduce on screen with me the director of Sugarcane, Julian Brave Noisecat, and the director, producer, and cinematographer, Kassie. Before we get into the conversation, let's show the trailer to the film.
I felt dirty as an Indian all my life in residential school.
Look at that. It's all names.
When you're brought up in an institution like the Catholic Church, you have strict rules, and you went with their ethics.
I've been trying to find out what happened at St. Joseph's Mission.
Everything was so secretive.
My dad was born there. How did it happen?
It's not something that you want to open up, it just keeps on damaging.
For decades, there were reports of neglect and children dying or disappearing from this facility.
2 girls drowned. Priests were moved around.
Why are they dying? Did they think we'd be stupid all of our lives, the rest of our lives, and nobody would ever find out these things?
Being sorry for something is just the first step. You have to take action.
We see the impacts in our community every single day. And we need to continue to hold each other up.
Julian, I ask you to open your heart. Our people are going to stand up.
Your story is someone who was abandoned, but also who abandoned.
You do know what happened with me, right?
I want to know the whole story.
I want to know the whole story too. So having said that, Julian, can you give me a brief synopsis on what this film is about?
The film follows specifically 4 characters from Sugarcane and the surrounding Indigenous community, as there's this investigation going on, which, is both getting at the truth below ground and also the truth above it in their lives.
Great. Thank you so much for that. And Emily, can you tell us how you both got together to produce and bring this project to us?
Yeah, so I'm an investigative journalist and documentary filmmaker, and I've been covering conflict and human rights abuses all over the world for the last decade, from Afghanistan to the Saharan desert. But I had never turned my lens on my own country. I'm Canadian, and the last year of residential schools was my first year of kindergarten, and yet I wasn't taught anything about it. So when the news of potential unmarked graves were discovered on the grounds of a residential school in British Columbia, I felt gut pulled to the story. And the first thing that I did was text Julian. Julian and I worked our first reporting jobs together almost a decade ago. We were randomly sat at the desks next to each other and became fast friends. And in the years since, Julian has gone on to become an incredible writer and journalist and historian of Indigenous life in North America, and felt like the right person to collaborate on a project like this. Jules told me he'd think about it. And in the meantime, I went looking for a nation that said they were going to do a search. And I found an article in the Williams Lake Tribune about Chief Willie Sellers in the Williams Lake First Nation. And I wrote Chief Sellers an email that day, and he called me back that same afternoon. And he said to me, "The Creator has always had great timing. Just yesterday, our council said we need someone to document this search." So I talked to council on Zoom, I got my gear together, and I booked flights, and 2 weeks later I was ready to go. And that's when I heard from Julian, and I'll pass it to him.
When I called them back, and it really was 2 weeks later, because I really had to think about whether I'd be open to and available to collaborate on such a heavy and personal subject matter. I told them, hey, I thought about that documentary, and I think that I'd be open to working with you on it. And that's when she said, that's great. I've identified a First Nation that's leading a search, and that search is happening at St. Joseph's Mission near Williams Lake, British Columbia. And I was completely shocked by what she had just said, because, of course, that is the school that my family was taken away to and where my father was born. So out of 139 Indian residential schools across Canada, M happened to choose the one school that my family was sent to and where my father's life began, without even realizing that that was the school that she'd selected.
Wow, that's more than a coincidence, isn't it? It felt like for me, it was almost serendipitous to bring closure or find some type of journey for your family to go on to find some type of closure with that particular incident. And it was fascinating to watch. Well, what was even more fascinating was in the trailer and also in the film, there's this one person that says, did they think we would be stupid our whole lives and no one would ever find out about this? I just want to know on the other side of this project now, what that means to you guys, because we're living in a time where erasures of certain histories are trying to be swept under the rug. And this was yet another incident, just like in the Tulsa massacre, just like with the Osage Nation, just like with so many other instances in America where people are trying to hide something, particularly when it deals with the Catholic Church. And I'd just like to get your opinions on both of your opinions on that.
Yeah, well, this is the foundational story of North America. Though there were 139 schools in Canada, there were 417 federally funded schools here in the United States. And this was a system that was created, in one of the words of its founders, to, quote, kill the Indian and save the man. And in Canada, to, quote, get rid of the Indian problem. And this was how the land was taken, by systematically separating 4+ generations of a family, taking the children away and forcing them into these assimilationist programs, and beyond that, systematically abusing them and breaking down familial ties. And that is what is trying to be reclaimed. I think people might want to think that this is a story of the past, and in some ways it's so critical that that history is rewritten and corrected, that the record is corrected. But more urgently, this is a story about the present. Communities, Indigenous communities, are suffering from the highest rates of suicide, of addiction, and cycles of violence that are a direct consequence of what happened at these schools. And without knowing that, without knowing the truth and getting to what happened, it's very difficult for these communities to move forward. And that's why the issue is so urgent now. And of course, on top of that, this is the first instance where a pattern of infanticide has been identified at one of these schools. And so this is journalistically significant. And this is just one school, and we know there are many more stories out there.
Absolutely. Can you speak to the fact that when the chief went to see the Pope, how they virtually kind of did nothing? Like, they got all this information. There was that moment in the office with him speaking to the one priest, talking about what had happened, and that really awkward moment of silence between the two of them before the priest said, "I'm so sorry that that happened to you." How many instances do we see where something happens like that and the response is verbally, "I'm so sorry that that happened to you," but it's very rarely backed up with any kind of physical or legislative action?
I think when we went to Rome, there was a feeling that there was a lot of emptiness and performance in the apologies by the Catholic Church. We follow a character named Rick Gilbert. He's a former chief. He also was abused at St. Joseph's Mission, and we follow him to Rome, where he goes to be a part of the delegation asking for an apology from the Pope, but he's also there reckoning with something much deeper, his own very dark history of what happened to him at the school, what happened to other generations of his family at the school, and what's living inside his very own DNA. And so he goes there with the hope not only of grappling with the institution of the Catholic Church, but also perhaps to find something within himself there in Rome. And he walks away. He's also, mind you, a practicing Catholic, and is grappling with this idea of faith. And he walks away with the kind of emptiness of that. And, you know, to this day, the church still needs to open their records so that Indigenous communities can, at the very least, have access to what happened. And they haven't paid their share in a kind of a sort of reparations and healing, and taking true accountability, not just for individuals who perpetrated violence, but the institution itself.
Great. Thank you so much for taking the time to answer that. I also wanted to ask you guys to speak to being drawn to the contradiction seen in all these lives of your subjects with the faith and the culture and the beauty and the weight of home and family, and how those things have been so fundamentally broken in the pursuit of the truth and facts that can both liberate and kill simultaneously.
You know, I think that the weight of this documentary for me is very intense. You know, I took some time to consider working on it at all because, you know, I think, let's be honest, it's a very heavy personal subject, and you know, it's unclear when anybody chooses to work on a documentary of a personal nature whether that is going to truly help or whether it's going to harm. I think another big part of it is that, you know, this is a deeply intimate world for me, one where I'm going to be buried someday, one where I have godchildren. It's the place that my family has come from and resided since forever. And to choose to make it with a non-native filmmaker is also, you know, took some time to really think through about how I felt about that. And ultimately, you know, I think that I took about a whole year of the first filming of Sugarcane to decide whether I felt comfortable, you know, working on the project, and to decide whether I felt comfortable including my own story in it. You know, that was a really significant decision. And, you know, the thing that really made me, there was sort of two things that really made me feel that ultimately I needed to step into it fully. And one was I moved in with my dad, who was born at St. Joseph's Mission, who was found in the school's incinerator, who is the only known survivor of the school's incinerator. And it became very clear to me that he wanted answers from, you know, that moment in his life, that he wanted to find healing. And I also felt that, you know, working on this film, watching someone like the late Chief Rick Gilbert share with us some of the rawest, most vulnerable, heavy parts of his background, you know, I ultimately felt that if he was going to give us that, if my Aunt Charlene Bellew, if late Rosalind Sam, so many others were going to trust us with that part of themselves, and here I was, the son of the only known survivor of a baby found in the incinerator at this school, and I wasn't willing to go there with my own story and my own family story, then I wouldn't be reciprocating their courage and generosity. And, you know, I ultimately also had like authorship of this, right? Like I'm a co-director. So I had the power to shape how the film and the story is told. And ultimately, I'm really glad that I did choose to do that. You know, this has been a very intense project, and it remains a very intense project for lots of reasons. But at the same time, you know, I think that it has brought a lot of healing to my dad, who I care for deeply. It's brought a lot of healing for my family. And beyond that, you know, now seeing how the film is received, particularly in Indigenous communities, I think it's, you know, non-Indigenous communities, it's opened a lot of eyes. In Indigenous communities, I think it's helped people feel really seen. and helped encourage people to speak out and share their stories. And for those reasons, I continue to be really grateful, not just from a creative perspective, but also from a life perspective, that M brought me to this story, and that I ultimately did make the decision with my family to share our weight.
As many more audiences begin to see this film, they will wholeheartedly appreciate the fact that you have opened up old wounds in order to heal them exponentially with your dad. And I want to thank you for being brave enough and open enough to continue to do that by having discussions centered around the film. So thank you so very much for sharing that. We really do appreciate it. And I think that that is the perfect place to lead us into the next clip.
It's not something that you want to just open up and, it's pretty fucking secretive stuff when you were born in a mission school and thrown away.
Well, for something that important to our literal existence, I think I want to know the whole story.
We don't have the whole story, because I don't know it.
Well, I think your mom would be the only person who knows.
It's kind of like it just keeps on damaging, just keeps on going.
I do think it's important to have gone home in the moment where they're trying to find the truth.
I've been dying to go up there, but, the shape of the roads now.
You're never dying to go up there. You don't go home that often.
That clip is intensely emotional for me, simply because, Julian, in the last answer to the last question, you talked about how your father was found in an incinerator. And then the last image that we land upon in that particular clip is the fire burning, which gives you the subliminal imagery of an incinerator and him sitting there with you. And it's very, very powerful, which brings me to Emily. How did you decide on the artistic approach to this subject with imagery, just as what I spoke of?
Yeah, well, from the beginning, Julian and I built a vision together for the film. We come from different artistic practices, him as a writer and me coming from a kind of visual practice, and we had a lot to learn from one another. He also has kind of a unique perspective and voice on these issues. And so when I was thinking about how I might shoot, and I shot the film with Christopher LaMarca, I really relied on those deep conversations that Julian and I had every day after shooting. And he would say something to me like, "This is a community living on the edge of death." Well, what does that mean? It means that Jules attended 10 funerals during the making of this film, and I attended several myself. These are communities that are still suffering, where the death toll from St. Joseph's Mission continues to climb. And so what that meant was getting 6 feet down in a grave with Chief Willie Sellers as he dug a grave for a good friend of his, a member of the community, and hearing the shovel move across the soil, seeing his shadow as he worked to support the community in such a physical way. So it was really that collaboration, those ideas that seeped into the language of the film and helped us build a tapestry of a kind of extraordinarily beautiful and epic world that was also overrun by colonialism and bastions of empire and iconographies of the Catholic Church.
Great, thank you so much. Julian, I don't know how to phrase this. There's a scene in which you and your father have a heart-to-heart talk, and you almost confront him, so to speak, about your feelings of feeling abandoned and how that has kind of filtered from his feeling of being abandoned. And I just wondered if you all have been able to come to some closure with that, because I know you said that you all are still working through stuff, but that was a very powerful moment. And we see you, you know, go and have a moment separate and apart from your father, and you both are having the same moment, but in different spaces.
Yeah, you know, the what Sugarcane endeavors to tell is a very complicated and nuanced story about the legacy of these schools. On the one hand, we get at some of the abuses that have not yet been reported at St. Joseph's Mission, which, you know, is a stand-in for 138 other residential schools across Canada and 417 across the United States. And the story that we tell specifically that has not been told at Sugarcane at any other school in Sugarcane is the story of what happened to the babies born at this school, which is that they were either adopted out, or in some instances they were forcefully aborted, or they were put into an incinerator and burned alive. And that was nearly what happened to my father. And you know, for me, and I think for him as well, a big part of grappling with this story is not just the story about what happened to the kids at the school, but it's also the story of what then happened in our own families and communities because of that suffering and violence and abuse. And so our story is one of intergenerational abandonment. You know, I was taken away when she was a small child to St. Joseph's Mission. She was not raised by her own parents because that was against the law at the time. And my great grandmother, Alice Noisecat, whose last name I carry, did not have the right to raise any of her children. My grandmother suffered abuse at the school that she still does not talk about. And when she became a young, unwed, pregnant woman, she hid the pregnancy, and then she had the child at St. Joseph's Mission. And that was my dad, the first of 8 kids that she had with my grandfather, Ray Peters. And, you know, my dad grew up in a very, very hard time on the Cannon Lake Indian Reserve. There was a lot of dysfunction because of the cycles of abuse and violence that started at the mission. You know, there was a lot of alcoholism. There was a lot of kids who were not being raised by their parents. My dad bounced around many households, lived between many places, and never felt loved by his mother as a child. And so when he, you know, grew up and ended up deciding where he wanted to live and how he wanted to make his life, he moved as far away as he could from the Cannon Lake Indian Reserve. And he actually met my mom outside of New York City, which to him was the furthest place away he could possibly imagine from a little res in Cannon Lake. And, you know, he was a great dad to me for a few years. When I was a little kid, I remember hanging out with him in the studio. He's, as you can tell from the clips, he's an enormous character. He's incredibly lovable. He's an amazing, amazing artist. He really is this towering figure in my life, and also in the life of my little sister, Zia. But he didn't raise either of us. He didn't know what it was to be parented. He didn't know how to parent, and he struggled with his own addiction, his own alcoholism. And so he wasn't there when we grew up. And he, you know, was carrying on and got in trouble with the law and had all kinds of his own crazy Indian adventures, and mostly misadventures actually. And you know, the process of making the film was, you know, I think in part an honoring of his experience, and telling that story in the most artistic way possible, which I think is the best way to honor the legacy of an artist like my dad. But it was also, you know, a grappling with, you know, what his abandonment then did to me, which was another generation of abandonment. I think that, you know, that is such a common story across so many different Native families, that begins with the residential schools. It begins with the fact that our people were denied the right to have families, were denied the right to parent for so many years. And so on the one hand, I still carry, a lot of wounds and a lot of pain from the fact that I didn't have my dad around, and I still wish that he was around more and all those sorts of things. And at the same time, I can't really hold it against him because I understand, I can never embody it fully, but I can come as close as possible to embodying it and feeling what it was to have grown up with the situation he grew up with, to have been born and abandoned. And every time I sit next to him and he watches Sugarcane, I feel that energy on him. And I'm just really grateful that he ultimately trusted me to go on this journey, and that it made us so much closer. Through the making of this film, we became best friends, and we had some of the best times of our life. And that was really special. And we've come out the other side of it now with so much more appreciation for each other, so much closer. And also, with this story that I think now is helping other people, especially other Native people, heal in the way that they need and want to.
I'm so happy to hear that this was a journey of healing for you and that you're on your way to the other side. I'm really, really happy to hear that. Emily, can you talk about, in the instance that someone hasn't had a chance to see this film, what is the one thing about this documentary that stands out for you now on the other side of it that you would encourage, that would make somebody want to check it out?
There are many things that make Sugarcane unique, but I think the thing that has been most powerful for me is that the film is a cinematic journey that allows audiences to enter deeply into this really beautiful world filled with people who are on epic journeys to face unimaginable obstacles, and it allows you so close into those lives. And there's a road trip, and there's a rodeo, and there's a powwow, and there's humor and life and hardship and all of those things that are so human, that we can all connect to. Though it is a horrific story and there's significant journalistic revelations, it's also I think a film that can really touch people and get at something in our core. And my favorite experiences in the cinema are things that stir me. And I think we feel really proud that Sugarcane has really been reaching people in that sort of, in that deep place where they can see themselves, whether they're Native or not Native, connect to the story. We all know what it's like to have pain and familial strife and secrets. And I think in that way, Sugarcane it can reach everyone.
It has reached everyone. It reaches their hearts. He reaches their spirits. It will make their spirit and their soul soar just by you and Julian sharing this story with the masses. It's going to heal so many more people. And I'm so happy again to see that you are on the journey to healing. And that road trip kind of healed me. I got my entire life with that road trip. You in the car singing. It was great.
I think we should add, it's also an ode to so many other road trip films in the lore of Native cinema: Smoke Signals, Powwow Highway. On the one hand, obviously this is real life documentary, but there's a lot of thought and intention put into every frame of this film, and which narrative and artistic traditions we're in conversation with, and of course there was, my dad's an artist.
Absolutely. And I love seeing his artistic visions laden throughout the film. That was wonderful to behold. Well, I think that brings us to the end of this conversation. I'd like to thank you all and thank our friends at National Geographic Documentary Films. And again, Julian and Emily, thank you so much for joining us. And to everyone watching, thank you for joining us today for a half hour with the film Sugarcane. I'm your host, Carla Renata. Bye-bye.